What's going on, everybody, and happy Friday. Now, I've been working on this video for about a week and a half now. Last week, we looked at the prolific playing career of Brent Key, being a part of some of the best offenses Georgia Tech has ever had, protecting two of the best quarterbacks to ever play on the flats. This week, we're going to look at the coaching career of Brent Key, which is actually quite interesting, and I guarantee there's going to be some things that you didn't know, even if you're a diehard Georgia Tech fan. Now, before we get into that, this video will be demonetized because I can't do a video like this without clips from like ACC Network and stuff. So your donations are much appreciated. Thank you to everyone who's donated to the channel. Thank you to the members. It allows me to do things like this. We have big plans moving into the future, particularly into this season. Be going to 2 away games. There's some other cool things we're doing. Now, a lot of you have asked me about the hat that I'm wearing. Now, I bought this on Fanatics. It's on the Fanatics site. If you become a member, I will be selecting one of you. You can either have your choice of WreckTalk apparel. We have hats, shirts, mugs, or I'll gift you one of these. So I will pick one random member before September 1st. You can have your choice of any one of those merchandise you'd like. You also get custom emojis and things for the chat. You get to make a video suggestion a month. Lots of cool things going on there. If you'd like to donate, there's a PayPal link and a CashApp link in the description. And you can always click the join button right below the title of the video. With that being said, let's get into it. Brent Key would finish a fantastic season as starting right guard for the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. He would win 70% of the games that he started in and be a part of some of the greatest offenses Georgia Tech has ever seen. He protected 2 of the greatest quarterbacks that have ever played on the flats in Joe Hamilton and George Godsey. So what was Brent Key to do when his playing career was over? Well, in 2001, he joined the Georgia Tech staff and George O'Leary as a graduate assistant. Now, this is a staff that would have, other than George O'Leary, 2 Georgia Tech head coaches on it, coaches who would become Georgia Tech head coaches. Obviously, Brent Key, who would become the interim and eventually the head coach in 2022. And Jeff Collins was on this staff. He was a graduate assistant in 2000 and would be promoted to a full-time staff position in the 2001 season. Georgia Tech would continue the success they had seen throughout the late 90s under Joe Hamilton, George Godsey. And George Godsey would throw for more yards in a single season in 2001 than any quarterback in Georgia Tech history. Georgia Tech would go 8-5. And win the Seattle Bowl against Stanford that year. Now, the success Georgia Tech had seen in the late 90s under George O'Leary would garner the attention of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. This is something that a coach has to learn. College football is a changing dynamic. There's head coaching changes throughout the country every year, and George O'Leary would be hired as the next head coach of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Being the head coach at Notre Dame is a dream destination for most any coach. Unfortunately, George O'Leary would only be the head coach at Notre Dame for 5 days after it was discovered that he had lied on his resume. On his resume, he had stated that he lettered 3 years at the University of New Hampshire, and leading into him being the head coach, a reporter had reached out to fellow teammates of his who said they had never played with George O'Leary, and in fact, he had never played at the University of New Hampshire. He was a student there after transferring from a school in Iowa where he played only for a year. In light of this, George O'Leary immediately tendered and offered his resignation to athletic director Kevin White, who refused to accept it. But he did ask, hey, is there anything else on your resume that's not true we need to be worried about? To which O'Leary would admit he had never obtained a master's degree from NYU Stony Brook. In fact, NYU Stony Brook was a fictitious school that didn't even exist. It was a combination of two schools about 50 miles apart in New York, to which his resignation was accepted. And it is tough when your idols, fall off a pedestal. The inaccuracies in O'Leary's resume started at his time at Syracuse, where he was a defensive line coach, where he filled out his biography, and he just failed to ever correct it as time went on. So after going through this debacle with Notre Dame, O'Leary would end up being hired by a former player and assistant with the Minnesota Vikings. He would get a position coaching defensive line, but would eventually become their defensive coordinator. But this left Brent Key looking for a job. His mentor, his longtime head coach, had just gone through this, what had to be embarrassing for everybody. So what does he do next? Well, he's reached out by a guy who he was on staff with under O'Leary at Georgia Tech and finds himself at Western Carolina University in 2004. Now, what's interesting is the guy who reached out to him. If you're a Georgia Tech fan, you'll know him well. I've done several videos on him. It was none other than Jeff Collins. Jeff Collins was defensive coordinator at Western Carolina. Made the call, got Key on staff. Key would coach tight ends and running backs while he was at Western Carolina, though he was only there for a year. The other interesting thing, though, is who was the offensive line coach and who would eventually become Western Carolina's offensive coordinator was none other than Matt Rhule. So this is where the Matt Rhule, Jeff Collins relationship started. This is the first time they were on staff together. And interestingly enough, Brent Key was on staff with them for a year. Now, Matt Rhule would leave there and end up going to Temple. Jeff Collins would actually leave there and become the recruiting coordinator in 2006 for Georgia Tech and would help build the best class that Georgia Tech has ever had. So for all the criticisms that someone would have for Jeff Collins, he was, a part of the best recruiting class we've had. Brent Key would only remain on staff at Western Carolina for the 2004 season before following his longtime coach and mentor George O'Leary to the University of Central Florida. George O'Leary would take the head coaching job at Central Florida in 2004 after a short stint as the defensive coordinator for the Minnesota Vikings. And what Brent Key and George O'Leary were able to build at Central Florida cannot be understated. Central Florida would not be poised to make a move to Power 5 football and the Big 12 without what Brent Key and George O'Leary were able to build. Prior to this, Central Florida was really a no-name bottom group of 5 school. Now, it would only take 2 years to win their first conference championship there. Brent Key would hold a plethora of coaching roles, including tight ends coach, run game coordinator, special teams coordinator, offensive lines coach, obviously, offensive coordinator, and assistant head coach. In 2007, like I said, they would win their first conference championship. And in 2010, Central Florida would become ranked nationally for the first time in program history. They would end the regular season with a 10-3 record and would get Georgia in the Liberty Bowl, which they would win 10-6, getting a win over the Dogs, and finished ranked for the first time in school history. This had never been done before at Central Florida, but that would just be the beginning. In 11 seasons with Central Florida, Brent Key and O'Leary would win 4 conference titles in 2007, 2010, 2013, and 2014. Just complete dominance of their conference in the group of 5. The 2013 season would be especially electrifying, as they would finish the season with a 12-1 record and would get wins over 2 top 10 programs, number 8 Louisville, and a New Year's Six Bowl bid. They would catch number 6 Baylor in the Fiesta Bowl. Central Florida and Brent Key would win their first Fiesta Bowl bid against number 6 Baylor in thrilling fashion with a 52-42 victory. And following the 2013 season, Brent Key's coaching star would begin to rise. He would be offered his first head coaching position at UAB, and he would decline this. Now, I can only speculate as to why that might be. He was already the heir apparent to George O'Leary. George O'Leary wasn't getting any younger. In fact, he would retire after 2 seasons. Or it could be that he wanted to get experience at a dominant Division I program. Either way, he would remain on staff. They would go on to win the conference in the following season in 2014. And during his time there, Brent Key would coach 8 all-conference offensive linemen who would be named all-conference 16 times in his time there. 4 of them would end up playing in the NFL. And he would also coach Conference Player of the Year and eventual starting NFL quarterback Blake Bortles. Unfortunately, the 2015 season would be a fall from grace for Central Florida, Key and O'Leary. They would start with 8 straight losses, and there's some debate from what I've seen as to whether O'Leary retired, left on his own terms, or he was forced out. And some of that probably comes from some controversies that happened while O'Leary was there. The Notre Dame debacle wouldn't be the only controversy of O'Leary's coaching career. Central Florida would be hit with recruiting violations, which would result in a postseason ban for Central Florida. They would end up appealing and winning. But most disturbing and concerning is in an off-season practice in 2008, a player would collapse and die. From what I've seen, him having a sickle cell trait was a contributing factor, but some of the players that were at the practice would say that O'Leary was especially hard and didn't do everything that he needed to do to recognize this kid was actually in serious danger. Now, I can say when a kid dies at practice like that, really for any reason, that's completely unacceptable and something catastrophically wrong definitely happened from a coaching perspective. But whether he chose to leave or was forced out, 2015 would be George O'Leary's last year at Central Florida. And it would be Brent Key's last year at Central Florida. We talked about his coaching star being on the rise, and it continued to rise. Brent Key would garner the attention of what has to be the greatest coach in college football history, Nick Saban. Nick Saban would bring Brent Key on staff as their offensive line coach in 2016. Interestingly enough, he would displace Mario Cristobal, who was the offensive line coach, but he would remain on staff. Mario Cristobal would move to tight ends coach. I think he also worked with the offensive tackles as well. And I think this shows just how well respected Brent Key is by really good coaches. If Mario Cristobal is good enough to be the head coach at Oregon, the head coach at Miami, and Brent Key displaces him, I think that speaks to just how good of a coach, and especially an offensive line coach, Brent Key is. Once Brent Key got to Tuscaloosa, Alabama would go on a complete tear. In the 3 seasons that Brent Key was the offensive line coach at Alabama, Alabama would make a national title appearance in all 3, in 2016, 2017, and 2018. In 2016, Alabama would beat Clemson in the national title. In 2017, they would end up losing to Clemson, and we all know about who Alabama beat in 2018 with Tua. Beat Georgia in the national title. So Brent Key would go to Alabama, win 2 national titles. Just absolutely amazing. Brent Key got to see, the heights of college football under Nick Saban at a preeminent program, and got 2 national title rings. Now, something that's not often talked about with Brent Key, many people will acknowledge how good of a position coach he is, but he was also named as a position coach the number 1 and number 2 recruiter in the country for the 2017 and 2019 classes. He would sign 5-star Evan Neal, offensive tackle, and 7 linemen that Brent Key personally coached would be drafted. That would be Jedrick Wills, who went number 10 overall, Jonah Williams, who went number 11 overall, Alex Leatherwood, who would go number 17 overall, and Cam Robinson, who would go number 34 overall, including others. So Brent Key had a very successful stint with Alabama. And interestingly enough, for the second time in his career, Jeff Collins would convince him to come on staff with him. And in the 2019 season, Brent Key would come back home to his alma mater to make a lateral move from Alabama to be the offensive line coach for the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. Key would join the 2019 staff with former Georgia Tech greats Tashard Choice and Marco Coleman. And there was a lot of buzz around this time about Georgia Tech football. Everyone understood this was going to be a very tough transitioning from the triple option with the departure of Hall of Fame coach Paul Johnson. And a lot of leniency was given, but along with that was the excitement of bringing Georgia Tech football, into the 21st century. Tech faithful knew this transition was going to be a difficult one with a complete roster turnover. I don't think anyone thought it would be this difficult. In 2019, in Key's first year as offensive line coach, Tech would suffer embarrassing losses to teams like the Citadel, who would beat Georgia Tech at home in overtime, never having had a victory over an ACC opponent. Tech would also lose to Temple, which was Jeff Collins' previous school. But there were some things to be hopeful about. Tech would get an overtime victory over Miami and also get a win over NC State. Unfortunately, Tech would enter probably the darkest period in program history. Key finally at his alma mater, and things appear to be going horribly. And it makes me think of my time at Tech, where I had a teacher talking about difficult problems. And she said, a problem worthy of attack proves its worth by fighting back. Tech would have probably the worst offenses in history. The offensive line struggled mightily. For instance, in 2019, Tech would only average 287 points a game. They would give up almost 500 yards a game on defense, and nothing seemed to be going right on the flats. Tech faithful would remain hopeful that the ship would be turned coming into the 2021 season, where they would suffer another embarrassing loss to NIU. Now, NIU would go on to win their conference that year, but in 3 years, Tech would only win 9 games. Many people not thinking that Collins would survive his third year after suffering horrible losses to Notre Dame and rival Georgia, totaling 100-0. This caused Jeff Collins not only to lose the locker room, but his own staff. There would be a mass exodus out of the program. Star running back Jahmyr Gibbs would transfer to Alabama. Many other players on the roster would hit the transfer portal. Most of his top class that he had built left. Georgia Tech alumni, Tashard Choice and Marco Coleman, left for other positions. And I have to wonder what was going through Brent Key's mind at this point, going into the 2022 season. I can only imagine, him staying. It was one of a few things. One, he loved Georgia Tech, and he knew the way Jeff Collins was running the program, was running it into the ground. Maybe he thought if he stayed on staff, he could try and counteract that. And if things kept going like they were going, he might get a chance to take the helm for his alma mater and the school that he loved for his dream job as a head coach. There would be a sparkle of hope going into the 2022 season, if only a fool's hope, with the dismissal of offensive coordinator Dave Patnode. He would be hired by Old Dominion, though strangely enough, he would resign 3 weeks before their season started. Tech would bring in former Notre Dame offensive coordinator Chip Long, hoping that he could inject some life into an otherwise dead and abysmal offense. This wouldn't be the case. Georgia Tech would continue to look undisciplined, heavily penalized, miss assignments. Special teams would continue to get worse, averaging a blocked punt a game, 2 against Clemson. Jeff Collins would continue to make very curious decisions as head coach and game management. And I don't know what to think was going on in some of these meeting rooms. As Key sees this going on, again, I have to imagine he was becoming more and more vocal about his opinion on how the program was being run. After Georgia Tech suffered one of the more embarrassing losses under Collins, though there were many, 42-0 to Ole Miss, Georgia Tech would lose to Brent Key's former school, Central Florida, and Georgia Tech administration would have enough and fire Jeff Collins in late September.
The news coming to us right now is that head coach of the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets, Jeff Collins, has been relieved of his duties.
Well, it's official. Jeff Collins has been fired as the Georgia Tech head coach. The news just broke.
With Jeff Collins out, Brent Key would be named interim head coach, and it would be his time to prove that he deserved to be the head coach of the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets in the following 8 weeks. And this would be no small task. Georgia Tech had just been awful up to this point, and Key didn't even know who he was auditioning for. Georgia Tech hadn't named a athletic director at this point. So what do you do if you're Brent Key? Get to work and change everything.
I would like to go ahead and announce that Jason Seymour has been promoted to from not only linebacker coach but also special teams coordinator.
One shot.
I talked to the team today, and
One opportunity.
There's a big difference in this game.
Sees everything you ever wanted.
Not wanting
One
to
moment.
lose and wanting to win.
Did you capture?
That's a big difference.
2nd and 11 for the Jackets.
His palms are sweaty.
Kamara again
His weak
flushes
arms are
Sims to
heavy.
his
There's
right,
vomit on his sweater
launching it
already.
downfield,
Mom's spaghetti. He's
and a
nervous.
terrific
On the surface, he
catch.
looks calm and ready
Oh,
to
my
drop
goodness.
bombs.
E.J.
But he keeps
Jenkins
on
holds
forgetting
it.
what he wrote down. The whole crowd goes
Sims
so loud. He
trying to
opens
dig
his
it out,
mouth,
and a
but the
big
words
play
won't
coming.
come out. He's
Quarterback
choking
into pit
out.
territory,
Everybody's
and
choking
inside
now.
the
The
30
clock's
goes
run
Jeff
out.
Sims.
Time's up. Over.
To the spot on the left.
Back to reality. Oh, there goes
Trying to get it
gravity.
with Davis,
Oh, there goes
and Georgia
gravity.
Tech
Choke.
not
He's
having
so
it. Ball
mad, but he
out.
won't.
Charlie
He
Thomas
won't.
picks it up.
He won't have
Thomas
it. He knows.
eludes
He's so
one,
mad, and he's rough.
gets
He
into
don't
pit
matter. He's
territory,
broke. He knows that, but he's
and will be
broke.
brought
He's so
down.
stagnant, he knows when he goes back to this mobile home. That's when it's back to the lab again, yo.
Slovis,
This old
Georgia Tech
rhapsody
rushes
better go
forward.
capture this moment and
Pops,
open up.
throws, and intercepted dismissal of Jeff Collins as the coach and Todd Stanford as the AD. Brent Key just asked those guys to stack days, and look what happened to them tonight.
The most important thing for Brent Key to do was to focus his team on the task at hand.
Who are undefeated and number 5 in the nation at Boston College tonight. Sims still has it. First down and more. Second level. Drags the pile. Past the 40 for Jeff Sims.
Fire up an offensive line coach that's now a head coach, offensive line man. That's for sure.
Sims spinning it. And the catch made. Down 5 receivers to choose from for Sims. He's looking right. He's looking at the goal line. And it's a touchdown, Georgia Tech.
Tight end Dylan Leonard really drive this guy over to the sidelines and create some space.
Sims deep. End zone. Touchdown, Georgia Tech. Third and goal. Leonard moves to his right, throws it inside the 5, and it's intercepted. Career long. To extend this football game in the first overtime. 52-yarder for Ham is no good. Georgia Tech wins 23-20 in overtime.
Coach Key, congrats on the second win in a row, and now you have a little bit of a break. I guess you take a deep breath, but not really a full bye week.
It wouldn't start out easy for Key as interim, with his first game as interim being on the road, number 21 Pitt, being a 3-score underdog. And Tech would look like a completely different team. The defense all of a sudden was getting turnovers. The offense wasn't turning the ball over. Key immediately made a change at kicker with Gavin Stewart, who hit 3 or 4 field goals in that game, which was a major contributor in winning. And for the rest of the season, Tech wouldn't have another block kick, though they would struggle, obviously, with punt coverage. And then Tech would follow it up with another win in overtime against a good Duke team. Both these teams would end up winning 9 games, and I believe their bowls that year. So in his first 2 games, Key would do something that Jeff Collins was never able to do in 3 1/4 seasons, win back-to-back games. Key did it in his first 2. Tech would follow that up with a game against Virginia, but everything doesn't always go according to plan. And Jeff Sims, who was nursing an injury from the Duke game, would go down and never take another stab as Georgia Tech quarterback.
You just want to stay in the fight all game.
They were looking for a screen. Virginia did a good job to read it. Sims did what he could. Ball pops out.
I think his knee was down, but...
And you see him slow to get up. He had the ankle last week.
With the injury of Jeff Sims, Key and Bunch would have to put in Zach Gibson, the backup quarterback, who just looked like he wasn't ready to play. Key made a ton of changes and improvements in just 2 short weeks, but you can't address everything in just 2 weeks. Gibson would take a lot of sacks, look like his feet were in cement, and curiously run the ball out of bounds to end the game when we were within a score of sending it to overtime. But Key would always look for what can we do now? It was apparent that Zach Gibson wasn't ready to play, and Key would pull Zach Pyron off the scout team and get him ready to play Florida State in the next week. Florida State would prove to be too much, a little too much talent for Tech, but Zach Pyron would play well and have moments. He would go on the road into Blacksburg to play Virginia Tech, which would be a back-and-forth game. Pyron would make some mistakes. He threw an interception in the red zone, but would come back and get a win against Virginia Tech for Key's 3rd win as interim coach.
Putting together a drive here. Thanks to that incredible catch by Carter up the middle. Dancing, first down and more. Dante Smith fought off the defender and took it to the end zone.
Yeah, that's
right, Brent Key. Clap a little bit on that one. He was an offensive lineman in his days there in Atlanta for the Yellow Carrot.
Byron. That is caught at the 30. Down the sideline, McCollum. He goes to the end zone. Touchdown, Georgia Tech.
This guy has great feel, great anticipation. Okay, that's fine, but we got Jeff Sims here. We're okay. Well, Jeff Sims is hurt. Zach Gibson, they struggled a little bit against Virginia, a little bit early against FSU, and Zach Byron trailing by 5 points with 3.5 left.
Fourth trip to the red zone for Georgia Tech. Byron up the middle, looking for the goal line, and he's in.
These state championships with 2 different high schools, Fife High School and Pinson Valley High School in Alabama. And
Wells lost the football. Georgia Tech trying to cover.
Key now in, Duke, Pitt, in 4 weeks had won as many games as Collins ever did in a single season. It was apparent something was different about this Georgia Tech team. Georgia Tech would host Miami at home in the following week with new life in the emergence of a young man, Zach Byron, at starting quarterback. But remember what I said earlier. A problem worthy of attack proves its worth by fighting back. And this audition and path to the head coaching job at Georgia Tech would prove its worth by fighting back with Key. Zach Byron would get hurt in this game. He would break his collarbone. He thought he had just dislocated it, but actually broke it and wouldn't find that out until he threw an interception on the following play. And it seemed like all hope was lost for Tech.
They are at Georgia for the 116th meeting between the programs. Byron takes off. Miami territory. Puts the shoulder down at the 35. Kinchin's on the tackle.
nice lead block there by Dante Smith. Good play call there by Coach Long, the offensive coordinator.
Little razzle gadget. Byron throws inside the 10, and it's picked off. The leaping interception from Tyreek Stevenson.
Now let's hear Zach Byron recount this very moment. You know, the Miami comes in. I'll be honest, when you scored the touchdowns against Virginia Tech, I thought you took an awkward hit on your shoulder there where the guy came in on the side of you. I don't know if if that might have given you banged you up a little bit there. But you come into Miami and I guess walk us through that, man. I mean, it's got to be heartbreaking to step up, be the guy in your freshman year, and have your season end there.
Yeah, I mean, it sucked how it ended, but, at least I got some experience. I got some playing time under my belt. And, going into the Miami game, I've tried to pride myself on being the toughest guy on the field that I can be, or being the toughest guy on the field. So I was battling some stuff already going into the Miami game. All the way back from the Florida State game that I was having to battle with. So, my thing is I can't make excuses for it, because I played in the game. And if you're going to play in the game, then, you got to be as good as you can be and prepared. So, Miami had a really good team. We kind of came out slow, and then we had that 99-yard drive right before halftime, and we were down 14-7. And then I think we had a good drive right at the third quarter, got stopped, and we were driving the ball again right before I got hurt and threw that interception on that trick play, but
that was after you got hurt.
Yeah, I broke my collarbone a drive before that. And, I kind of got up, just thought I dislocated it. And I was like, I think I can keep playing through it. So I didn't say nothing. And, as soon as I went to clap to get the ball, I really couldn't move my left hand. I was like, yeah, it don't feel right. And as soon as I threw it, I was like, yeah, I don't have any power because, that was a touchdown if I'm not hurt. Dylan's wide open. I can throw it. It's not going to be undercut and anything. And we have a tie game right there. So, I wish I wouldn't have got hurt. The game might have been a little bit different. I would like to say we would have tied it up that drive. It would have been 14-14. But, that's football. You got to deal with adversity. Like Coach Winkie says, you can't blink an eye. You got to keep going. And, I tried to play through it for as long as I could. And I was just like, I'm just going to end up hurting the team if I keep trying to. So
the loss of Zach Pyron would be devastating. Brent Key now has lost his starting quarterback and veteran quarterback, Jeff Sims, to injury, who it turns out would never play for Tech again, now is transferred to Nebraska, and his backup quarterback, Zach Pyron, who had injected new life into the team after the injury of Jeff Sims, seemed to be the guy moving forward. Now, the only quarterbacks that Key has are his third and fourth string quarterback, Zach Gibson, who had not shown the ability to win any game, let alone against top 15 opponents, and Pumachan, who hadn't played well or really at all up to that point. So what do you do if you're Brent Key? Do you just say, look, we've got number 13 North Carolina coming up and the number 1 team in the country, undefeated Georgia. You know what? This is more than any coach could be expected to overcome. I've now inherited one of the worst teams in Tech history, and I'm down to my third and fourth string quarterback. Let's just roll over, wave the white flag. Hopefully I've done enough to earn the job, and let's just get to the offseason. No, that's not what Brent Key does. There's always something that you can do, and you just do the next thing in front of you, which for Brent Key was, let's prepare this team to go on the road against North Carolina. We've already won one game. We're 3 touchdown underdogs in Pitt. Let's get Zach Gibson ready. Let's work with Winkie and Gibson, get them ready for this game, not make mistakes on offense, and make plays on defense. And he would go to Chapel Hill with Georgia Tech and shock the world for a second and third time.
Taking a long time to change up this play. Gibson underneath, wide open hole, inside the 20, the 15, the 10, and down to the 5. First and goal, Jackets.
Running backs out of the back
side of the line.
I'm spilling these rats long as you fill them to the day that I drop. You'll never say that I'm not
Smith up the middle.
When I am not, then I'ma stop pinning
And he
them.
forces his way in. Touchdown, Georgia Tech.
Subliminal thoughts.
Capping off an 84-yard drive. But not a whole lot of time together with the transfers. May sacked for the third time tonight. Keon White got there.
Keon White with a first half hat trick. Tech recovers.
And they get the first down. It's coming right up the middle. And they got the screen set up for Smith inside the 20. And hauled out of bounds at the 15.
Empty backfield.
Pumachan runs right behind those stacked tight ends, and he's in. Touchdown, Yellow Jackets. He was reporting on earlier tonight, the great teams find ways to avoid trap games like this. And the trap has been set by Georgia Tech this evening. And it's the 4th sack of the night for their defense. This time it's Jason Moore.
Nice job by you, John.
They have been winning the line of scrimmage. 10 tackles for loss tonight. And the pass is intercepted. Miles Brooks. And it's the first Drake May interception in 5 games. 196 consecutive pass attempts without a pick. Carter breaking free across midfield. He takes it inside the 25 and shoved out of bounds by Gio Biggers. Gibson gives to Hall. Cuts it back and into the end zone. Touchdown, Georgia Tech. And the Ramblin' Wreck pull in front. It's 3 points to show for it in the first half. They had a 68-yard touchdown run called back by a penalty. And another sack for the Georgia Tech D. That's the 5th of the night. And Keon White down 4 with 4:18 to go. Josh Downs is in the backfield. May throws for the end zone.
defensive player, Nate McCollum. He wasn't suited up. And yet the heart, the fight, the will of this football team led by Brent Key.
And the Tech defense that did not let Drake May and Josh Downs beat them.
Take questions.
Yeah, outstanding gameplay by our guys. In all phases, those guys, we developed a plan during the week. They understood the plan. Plan might not have made sense to a lot of people, but it made sense to the people that came on that plane up here to go play. They understood it. They bought into it. They believed in it, and regardless of what the score was in the game, they stuck to that. And they believed that sticking to the plan would give them the outcome that they wanted.
Brent Key would take his team on the road in the following week against #1 University of Georgia. And Key would have his team ready to play. Tech would come out, score in their opening drive, again with their third and fourth string quarterbacks against the #1 defense in the country. Something that hadn't been done in a few years. A team had not scored in their opening drive against Georgia in a few years. And that game would be tied going into halftime. I was at that game. I can remember the looks of bewilderment in the crowd. I remember one person saying, what's happening? What is this? What team is this? Tech would go on to lose that game, but would have a very respectable showing against the #1 team in the country. But Key was asked in his press conference about moral victories, and Key made it clear he's not here for moral victories. He came to win the football game, and Georgia Tech played like it. But now things were out of the hands of Brent Key. He had done everything he could do to prove that he deserved to be the head coach. He had gone 4-4 in his 8 weeks as interim, including 2 3-touchdown underdog victories on the road to ranked ACC opponents. Things now would be in the hands of Jay Batt. Many names were thrown around. Rumors are that Jamie Chadwell was interviewed. There was even an article published by the AJC that Willie Fritz had been named the head coach. But time would tell who would be the next head coach of the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets.
I want you to know we conducted an exhaustive search. We looked all over this country, talked to a ton of people, and at the end of the day, there was a bunch of people that had an interest in being the head coach of your football team. I think we found the right person to lead. So, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the new head football coach.
Though it was a difficult road from losing both first and second string quarterbacks to losing Nate McCollum, wide receiver later in the season, to changing the entire identity of a football team, Brent Key would earn the right to call himself head coach of the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. And he would get right to work, making difficult decisions, parting ways with staff such as offensive coordinator Chip Long that came with a $750,000 buyout, bringing in Buster Faulkner from rival UGA, convincing Marco Coleman to come back to coach the defensive line after just being at Michigan State for a year, to now having a top 25 recruiting class going into the 2023 season. So this is what I wanted to talk about. I saw a comment on the last video. Why are you doing this? We don't even know if Brent Key is going to be good. And I'll tell you why I wanted to do this. I can't tell you how many times I've seen it said, or even entire videos dedicated to Brent Key is a lazy hire. Oh, people rally around the interim. I don't know if people generally rally around an interim coach or not. You can call it rallying behind an interim. I call it good coaching and a man that knows how to develop young men to play the game of football. Brent Key might not be the right hire for most schools, but here's what I do know. He's the right hire for Georgia Tech, and we're going to see this season just how good of a coach Brent Key can be. And I, for one, am excited. So I hope you enjoyed that. I know it was a long video. It took me a long time to put together. I appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you soon.